Um, this is German Research for the Everyday American, and this is the presentation that I gave at Roots Tech in 2020. This is, when I gave the presentation, I realized that's a whole lot to put into one presentation. So I wanted to break it down for you guys just because I really want each part to be useful. So what we have here is I'll be doing it in 3 parts. So the first one today is Meyer, 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 where are you from? Spelling variations and finding a hometown. Then the handwriting will be for next month. And then in May, we'll do looking at the actual German records. And this slide's also at the end. So you can get a screenshot of it, or we can send out the schedule afterwards too, but just so you get an idea of how things are going to play out. Okay, so with German research, the biggest, our goal is most of us are Americans. We need to find out where in the German Empire our ancestors came from. And that is no small task. There are a lot of difficulties, and we're gonna talk about the main ones. So spelling variations and finding the hometown, those ones we'll do together today. Then reading the handwriting and navigating the German records will be the next 2 months. So in our spelling variations, this one, I titled the presentation Meyer, 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 because that's a very common name that a lot of people know. And I wanted to show how, even if you have a very common surname, there are still a lot of different ways that it can be spelled. This is one of my German surnames. It's pronounced Heidke. And all of these are spelling variations for the name Heidke. So don't worry, it looks a bit overwhelming. We're going to break it down a bit. So how does one name have so many spelling variations? One big thing is that spelling didn't really exist until the late 1800s in the German language, when they finally sat down, wrote out the rules. And then it wasn't until later on that it really caught on in the general population. So the way that something sounded and the way that it was spelled were not always fixed. The spelling wasn't fixed for a very long time. So that being said, if your family has a strong tradition of this is how our last name is spelled, that's great to keep track of it for a certain amount of time. But before that, there could be any number of possibilities. And sometimes it can be a little shattering, like, wait, what? That's our thing. But it's, one of those traditions that came in later along the way. So another cause of spelling variations is that when Germans came over and they settled in their communities in the United States, there were accents mixing, and they were also mingling in their own German communities, but with the Americans that already lived there. And so if you ever called tech support and spoke to somebody who was not from the United States, then you can kind of get an idea of some of the challenges that we were facing there. We also, the spelling variations are even more difficult in the United States than when we get into German records. Even when you cross the ocean and find your ancestors in German records, you're going to see that it changes. The way their name's spelled changes. What I've seen a lot is that it changes with the pastor writing the church book. He'll say, Heidka is spelled this way, but before, the pastor that was before him spelled it a totally different way. And so you'll just kind of see those shifts throughout time, but thankfully you have the people, like the family groups, to be able to keep it together. Like, oh, that's spelled differently, but we've got this couple and they're having these children. So it's the family relationships help to reassure us. And then, as I was saying, in these German communities, there were group migrations, but there were also single families that came and just settled near other Germans and went to church with other Germans. And so sometimes the priest, even though he was German, he's recording his congregation, he might not have heard of this surname before, or he spelled it differently. And then, of course, we're not only looking at records created by Germans, but we're looking at records of Germans in the United States. That's our starting point. And that's probably where a lot of the difficulty comes from, because if someone with an accent says something to you and your job is just to write it down, they didn't always ask, oh, how do you spell that? They just said, I think this is what they said. And even though that sounds a little ridiculous, there are some pretty important records that you look at them and you're just like, what? So just wanted to kind of set the scene for what we're dealing with, but don't get discouraged. There are 3 keys. So I studied under Dr. Roger Meyer, and he's a very good researcher, and he came up with these 3 kind of predictors of spelling variations. Is it natural? Is it logical? And is it predictable? So there are some things that we just wouldn't consider, and we're going to see how, like, what does natural, logical, and predictable mean? So it all has to do with phonetics, which is the science or study of speech sounds and their production, transmission, and reception. And each of those plays a part in the spelling variations that we're going to see. We're going to focus on the production because I think that's the simplest way to figure out spelling variations on your own. So we want to look at how do we produce the sound of a letter and what other letters are produced in a similar way. So when you're thinking about spelling variations, you want to get very intimate with your mouth and how it works. So there are some very strong, these ones I think are the easiest, are the consonants to predict spelling variations. So there are these voiced and unvoiced pairs, which means in this list of letters, these letters are essentially the same, B and P, D and T, G and K, the sounds that they make, and I'll show you in just a minute. They're essentially the same, but one of them is voiced and one is unvoiced. So if you think about your mouth, B and P, B and P, they're produced by doing the same exact thing with your mouth. It's called a plosive. So you put both your lips together and you blow air through them. B, P. And the difference between how they're produced is that with the B sound, you engage your voice box, and with the P, you don't. And it's the same with D and T. You bring your tongue to the back of your top teeth for D and T. So it's just that voiced and unvoiced. G, K, V, F, Z, and Ch, K. Those ones are not quite, or CH and K are not as exact a pair, but they're often interchangeable in the names that we find. So vowels, I think, are a lot trickier, and a lot of times when I'm making spelling variations, I more or less imagine the consonants as fixed, at least their places. So there's an example coming up next. But vowels, they're all essentially made with just the space in your mouth. Nothing is touching. So if you change the height of your tongue and the openness of your mouth, you're going to get all the vowel sounds like I. So it's really silly, but it helps to make those sounds to try to figure it out. So like I said, vowels are trickier, and I generally focus on the consonants because sometimes depending on accents, the vowel shifts can get kind of wonky, but the consonants generally are a pretty good indicator of the name. So we're gonna use nachtigall, which is the word nightingale. So we'll start by doing CH to CK, and we know CK and K make the same sound, so we'll just put it to a K. T to D, G to K, double L to single L. Double and single letters, those go back and forth all the time. And also H's, there are a lot of words and names that sometimes they'll have an H and sometimes they won't. Generally, like a silent H can be thrown in a lot of places. So we go from nachtigall to nachtigall. They sound quite similar, even though aside from the N, almost all of the consonants are different. So then you can also change the vowels, but if you know kind of your consonant anchors, what you would expect in those places, then the vowels won't throw you off too much if you find something with different vowels. Okay, so I also want to just say that those spelling variations occur with surnames and also with the names of the hometown. And I apologize, I drink a lot of water because my mouth dries out really quickly. So now we're going to dive into finding the hometown from American records. A lot of people ask me, well, isn't there just like, isn't there just like a database of all of the Germans? And if we find this person with this date of birth, can't we just find them in German records? There's no such database yet. There are a lot of great index records on Ancestry and things like that that are very, very helpful. And sometimes I was researching for a cousin and I did just find an index record on Ancestry. And so you always do want to check those databases, and we're gonna just do a quick little run through of where to find those kind of things. But a lot of times you need to have the exact town where the person was born in order to find them. And finding the hometown is difficult for a lot of reasons. One being that if you meet someone from a foreign country, and I'll just give the example of my friends in Germany, and I'll say, hey, where are you from? And they say, oh, I'm from Balva. And I just kind of, furrow my brow like, huh, I haven't heard of that before. So then they'll say, oh, it's near Dortmund, or Köln, which is Cologne. So when you're speaking to other people who aren't familiar with where you're from, you tend to just give the next biggest city. Like for a lot of people, if they're not from Massachusetts, I'll say, oh, I'm from Boston, or 45 minutes north of Boston. My hometown means nothing to them, which is an unfortunate mindset because our ancestors' hometowns mean so much to us. And, we just wish that they knew that and put it in every single record that they ever were in and told everyone they ever knew. But it's not always the case. So we really got to dig for it. And so let's move on to how we can do that digging. Okay, so the short answer for where will I find a hometown, where do I need to look, is let's look everywhere. There are some really great sources, but I would say I've probably found a hometown in every place that you could possibly think of. Church record, naturalization records, passenger list, death certificate, a child's birth certificate, a child's baptism. All of those places are fair game. And so before you give up, hopefully you won't give up, but you want to make sure that you've checked everything that you can. And sometimes even if you're lucky enough to have a journal or some kind of letters from your ancestors, you can find that information there as well. So I'm going to start with where do you want to start? Like, where's the low-hanging fruit? And that's ancestry and family search. So ancestry.com, they have, you go up to the top, there's search, and all collections is a good place. But also immigration and travel kind of narrows it down, because sometimes if you say all collections, you just get hit with everything that has anything similar to your ancestor, and you might skip, it might focus on certain records that aren't as helpful. And so I would recommend doing all collections, but also try to narrow it down to immigration and travel. And as a quick example, I'm just going to put in my third great grandfather, Edward Rohr, and he was born about 1869 in Prussia. And I'm just going to start with that because I don't know how many Edward Rohrs are out there. Well, I do know how many, but we don't always know that when we start. So we've got a hit from the Hamburg passenger list, naturalization record indexes, arriving passengers. So all kinds of different records here. I'm just gonna show you this one because I know this is the one that I'm looking for. And I checked out the other ones and they didn't quite line up with what I needed. So this is Edward Rohr's, this is all that's left of his naturalization papers. If you've seen naturalization records before, then you know it's a process. They start with a petition for naturalization saying, hey, I'm here and I intend to stay and I promise I'm going to be good. And then there's a certificate of naturalization, and they attach arrival records sometimes. So if you come into a collection like this, you want to search in both directions and search for all the records that you can. I've studied this one really in depth, and so I know that his petition for naturalization was lost. But so this is Edward Rohr, and this one is really unfortunate because it just says that he's from Prussia. I've read it so many times and there's nothing more. Prussia is a really big place, so it's not incredibly helpful, but it's wonderful that it exists. Naturalization records after 1906 are the most helpful because there was a much more in-depth process, and there's a lot more information. But if they're there, you want to see them, even if they look like Edward's naturalization record. We still love them. So that's just a quick rundown of the quick search on Ancestry, and we'll go to family search because there's a couple different ways that we can search on family search. Well, there are a lot of different ways to search on family search. But so if we do search records. This is kind of the simplest way to do it. This one is going to search index records and just all the collections that they have. And so it's kind of like that search all records on Ancestry. And then if you do that and don't quite find what you're looking for, then sometimes I will come down to this find a collection, and I'll want to see, okay, do they have an index collection of naturalizations from New Hampshire? So I'll type in New Hampshire, and it's going to pop up with all of the New Hampshire collections. And then I want to add naturalization to see, it looks like they have 3 different collections. And I tried all of these earlier. This one doesn't actually have an index search that you can do. So browse is basically like if you're going to the library, you're going to open up a book and look page by page. Maybe there's an index at the end, maybe there isn't. So it can be a little daunting, which is why we always want to start with the easier collections first. So anyway, so a similar thing with the search with Ancestry. You can try any of those collections. You can also do like passenger lists and then see what collections they have in here. So those are kind of your basic starting points. You just want to search those to make sure that you're not missing anything that's going to be really easy, because with German research, I promise you're gonna have time to tackle all kinds of things. So make sure to hit the easy stuff first. Okay, so a little bit more on naturalization records. This is an example for a man named Albert Meyer. Sorry. So a little bit of a closer look. As you can see, these are the later naturalization records that I was talking about that have a ton more information. But there's a couple of interesting things to point out that pertain to spelling variations. On this one record, if you look, the blue circles are his name. So we have Albert Meyer, M-E-I-E-R. And then down here, M-E-Y-E-R on the same record. So that's interesting, but I think it kind of really calls out the importance of looking for variations. Then we have the hometown name. Here it says Mülheim, here Mülheim. Looks like maybe even a syntax error, like a little typo with the K and the H, because they're similar letters. I'm not sure. And then on the next page, we have M-U-E-L Heim and Muheim. So within one record, we're just seeing all kinds of craziness. And this is not too common. I think I probably see it most on these naturalization records. So one thing that I wanted to say just about when you do find something like this, a record, and you're like, okay, so apparently he has 5 hometowns that are all similarly spelled. What do we do with that? And I would like to take you to a website called Meyer's Gas, and if I can figure out how to get there, I'll have to escape the presentation. Okay, so Meyer's Gas is a gazetteer, so it's a place name index for the German Empire, which you may have heard that, or heard just based on history, that German places changed hands a lot. There were kingdoms and duchies and principalities, and almost everything you can think of. And there were all kinds of battles and wars and deals and, hey, I have a chunk of territory in yours and you have one in mine. Can we just like swap ownership, keep our kingdoms kind of in one spot? So Meyer's gazetteer kind of just makes a still frame of like, at this point in time, all of these places were in the German Empire, and we're going to call them by these standardized names so that we don't get all turned around in the research. And it's definitely fun to look into once you have your place figured out, to be like, okay, and that was, you know, for 100 years it was part of this kingdom, but then it was conquered by these guys. Now it belongs to this. But when we're looking for records, we just want to keep a laser focus so that we can be efficient. So this will help us to find the name of the place we're looking for. So if you have a bunch of spellings like that, I would just say try them all. So we had a Mulheim, and that gives us a bunch of places called Mulheim. And then I'll show you, there was a Mulheim in there. So sometimes what you put in doesn't come up with a result, and you can go to sounds like, and that'll sometimes say nothing, which is why you want to try all the different options. And the one that they had in there, sorry, M-U-K, or I think it was M-U-L-K-E-I-M. That one was kind of an outlier. So we're not going to be too, so it did come up with a Mukam. So that's a possibility. But I think this Mulheim is kind of what most closely resembles that place. And as you can see, there are several Mulheims, but looking for records in, you know, 8 different places is a lot better than just having all of Prussia or all of Baden or Bayern to Bavaria to start looking for your ancestors. That's not really a feasible starting point. So when we have something, even if it's several different towns that are a possibility, then we can really start to narrow it down. And also sometimes you'll find, you know, the census in some years, they actually recorded like the states that they were from or the kingdom. And so sometimes in the census, it will say this person was from Rhineland. And so you're like, okay, well, these are mostly in Rhineland, and then these ones in Westfalen we'll maybe put later on our list. We won't start with those because we have a hunch that they were from Rhineland in a place called Mulheim. So it's just a little bit of combining resources to find out the right hometown. Meyer's Gaz is a very important tool that you'll want to refer to a lot. And later on, when we get into German records, I'll go into a lot more in depth into different ways to use it because there's a lot of great information on there. Okay, and then I already showed you, oh my, okay. I already showed you Edward's naturalization record that just says Prussia. Sometimes that's the case, but we don't give up. We just look for the next record set. Okay. So as I said before, there are several parts of a naturalization record. Make sure if you are looking at a picture, you look in both directions. Anything with your ancestor's name on it, you want to see. And then this is one that actually is very helpful because sometimes Especially, I found this especially amongst Jewish families. They would arrive with one name and use a different name in the United States and maybe have another name even. So they had kind of like a Jewish name and a name of that was of the language where they lived. So if all the papers made it together into one place and that made it online, then it might even say, hey, the passenger list recorded this person with this name. And then you know if there's anything very different that you need to keep your eyes open for. And I would say I see that a lot more with like the Jewish ethnicity than with just Germans like Protestants or Catholics. Okay, passenger lists are awesome as well. And they, depending on the list, the information varies a lot. And just a quick note, you might have heard of the Hamburg passenger list. That's an awesome collection that is, I believe, fully indexed on Ancestry, or at least a lot of it is indexed on Ancestry. They're, so those are the largest collection of German passenger lists from like coming from German-speaking lands. There's also the Bremen passenger lists, and they were largely destroyed during World War II when the harbor was bombed, which is very unfortunate, but some collections, some groups of records still survive from that. And we also have arrival records. So, so this one is like a list of passengers bound for the United States. It's in English, and we're going to take a little bit of a closer look. So this is the first like amazing passenger list that I saw. Some of them are really, really hard to read, but some of them are like this, and we have these people's names. I'll tell you, Germans have a lot of names, like Cecilia Maria Theresia. It's not uncommon for someone to have 3 first names, or first/middle names, and then their last name on top of that. And when you find a name like this, you want to just keep an open mind again. We always want to be open-minded with names. You could find them in records with 1, 2, all 3, or a mix-up combination of the 3 names. And that's how I ended up finding these people in their German hometown. I believe it was Maria that I found. And she was called like Theresia Cecilia or something like that. Anyway, so this is kind of line 1 continues down here. So this passenger list is incredible in that it gives us an exact hometown, Gevelsberg, and then for Maria Theresia, we have Marburg. So those are, and those places, you know, you take them to Meyer's Gazetteer and see if that's exactly the way that they would be spelled, or if there's anything different that you need to look for as well. Okay, so a lot of American records. I'm not going into birth, marriage, and death records. Those are quite common to almost all genealogy. So if anyone has specific questions about those, you can ask that at the end. But those are great records to look at, especially the closer they are to us in time. The more accurate I see hometowns. A lot of them just say Germany or Prussia or Bavaria or something like that. But you always need to check them, because sometimes you just hit a gold mine and you don't want to miss that. So one incredible record set that is available in some places where German-speaking churches were established in the United States. Is their church records written in German, and they're most likely written in the Old German handwriting, which is next month's lesson. It's a big barrier, but there are a lot of incredible tools, and even some that I'm still learning about, that I want to show you to be able to kind of help you knock down the intimidation factor. Okay, so the best thing about these records is that they were written by Germans for Germans. So it's you're cutting out the language barrier. I mean, there's one between us and the records because we're not native Germans, but at least when they were written, a German spoke the name and a German heard and recorded the name, and that helps us out a lot. As I said earlier, there are still some troubles with dialects and things like that, but these records are great where they exist. Often the pastors were more familiar with the hometowns and less likely to butcher them like us Americans did, and still do, I'm sure. And then they were more familiar with German phonetics, so you might not see the more extreme spelling variations that we tend to see in American written records. Okay, and so this is an entry from a German church book. It's a family register, which the common church records, because they're recording their sacraments or their ordinances, are baptism or christening and marriages and usually burials or last rites. So events surrounding birth, marriage, and death, which is why they're so helpful. They also sometimes have family books, which just record a family group. And sometimes they say, okay, these people, you know, the parents came from here and these are all their children. And also their grandparents lived here too, so we're gonna throw them in there. They're very cool records. They are compiled records, so they're not the primary source. They're not, you know, they don't happen necessarily they're not recorded at the time of the event. They're pulling from what they know about the family and, okay, well, they were baptized at this point, so we'll write it in there as well, but maybe they went at a later time and put the information in. So we always want to try to verify that information with the actual records, and that'll also usually lead us to more information. So I picked a record that was in a German book, but not actually in the German handwriting. It's just Latin handwriting with some slight variations, but it's not too crazy. We'll look at crazy stuff next month. So here we have Maria Boisman or Busman, depending on, you know, where the minims are. And then, so this has their name and position. Position sometimes means their occupation or whether they're single or married. It can also, if it's like around a castle or something, then it might say they're like whether they're royalty or a servant or something like that. So that word Stand is kind of versatile depending on where the records are made. So then we have her parents, and then down here we have a place name. We have Gerda, Gehrde in Hanover. And when I put this one into Meyer's Gazetteer, it showed me a place name with no H. So that's another example of when an H is thrown in because H's were part of the language. And later on, they decided okay, this H doesn't really serve a purpose. Let's just get rid of it. So that's just, I think, a cool example. And so just a little more on church records, and how to find them is probably, I would say, the most difficult thing that we're going to face with them. There's a collection called German Immigrants in American Church Records, and it's a series of books made, directed by Professor Roger Meyer and compiled by him and students. I was on this project when I was studying at BYU, and what we would do is look through church records like this, and we would, every time we saw a German hometown, we would find out the correct spelling of the hometown in Meyer's Gazetteer, and then we would put that individual into the book. So it's basically an index of all these people in church records who had a German hometown, and whether it said the exact hometown or just Hanover or Prussia, we would put that in there so that it would be easier for people to find their ancestors, because sometimes trying to find the records of a certain church is a big task, but it's very invaluable if you have, if your ancestors are in these German church records. So it's definitely worth the trouble. Sorry, so we're going to talk about how are we going to find those records. And sorry, this part I need to deviate from the slides because it was made in the in the event that the internet failed. I made a slide for each step of an internet search that we would do. Okay, so for these church records, I would like to introduce the Family Search Catalog, which is very, it's important to know how to use this to get beyond the standard records that are indexed. So it's a search function. We go to catalog, and this is basically like going to the library. And there are all different ways to search the catalog: place, surname, title. So if you are looking for books about something specific, and this has books, microfilms, and digital collections that are at the Family History Library. Also, it'll tell you if they're at a different family history library, because there are some substantial collections that are not at the main library, but like I think I don't remember which one, Los Angeles, I think, has a lot of collections that are only there, and that's kind of important to the population that lives there. So with German research, I most commonly search by place. And so let me just double check what the town was where I found this little gem. Okay, New Ulm in Brown County, Minnesota. So if you are looking for an ancestor that is in New Ulm, then you can put in the city name, and then it'll give you the different options. You just pick which one is applicable. And this is what I mean by it's like going to the library. So basically, we go to the library, tell the librarian, I want to see everything that you have on New Ulm in Brown County, Minnesota. Then she can take us to a section of shelf that just has a row of books. And so this is basically our row of books organized by category. And since New Ulm is a city, it has several collections of church records, and they may not all be on Family Search. So sometimes you want to do some Google searching to see, if you don't find your ancestors by looking through these records, you want to do a Google search to see if there was if there historically was a church near them that still exists. They might be keeping their own records. They may not have gotten them on Family Search, or they may not want them on Family Search, but they might be open to letting you see them anyways. So this is pretty awesome, and you can, kind of get some history of the church, or sometimes there are just history books on the city. And in a lot of places, so like my German ancestors came to the mills on in Exeter, New Hampshire, and that's not necessarily the typical German immigration pattern. We find a lot of Germans in the Midwest, in the area called the German Belt, that come in through different methods. Some people came up through Texas, or I think Louisiana. And so they weren't always settling in big cities. Sometimes they were in like a township that doesn't even exist anymore. So sometimes searching by city is not the best way, but we would want to search by county, because there was only one church for the whole county, and all the German speakers went there. So I just wanted to give kind of a brief introduction to the catalog. There are lots of ways to search it, and I'll just go quickly into one of the church records. And this one's on microfilm, so we actually can't look at that one. Some of them are just on microfilm, and you'll have to do, when the Family History Library opens back up, or if it's worth it to you to pay someone to go look at the records, just find a way to get your hands on them. So some of the records are only on microfilm, and let me just look for a collection that's digitized so that I can show you briefly, just to get an idea of what it looks like to find a record in the catalog. So if it has a magnifying glass next to it, that means you can search a digital index. And I would always say, if you suspect your ancestors could be there and you don't find them in the digital index, still look in the collection if you have the time, if you don't see anything more promising, because sometimes the magnifying glass is there before the collection has been completely indexed. Family Search really works hard to help people find their ancestors, and so sometimes they'll have a partial index, but they'll make it live already, because somebody can find someone already, but it's not always indicative of a complete index. If you click on the camera, then it will take you into the record set, and it's basically a snapshot of each page in the record. And depending on how that record was set up, there might be an index at the beginning or at the end. You always want to check for that, because it can be, if the collection has 1,096 images, it could take a long time to find your needle in that haystack, but we always want to look for any kind of index, digital or handwritten, on a digital image. Those are all very, very important. And so it'll be just kind of like looking through a book if the page is open this way and didn't flip. And you're kind of you want to hone in on these black tiles, because that tells you the section. So this is just the index to the death records from 1870 to 1925. So since it's an index, then you just automatically think, okay, I bet it's going to be alphabetical, and I'm looking for a Z, so I want to go way way down in the collection. So that is a basic introduction to the family history, family search catalog. It's an incredible resource. It takes a little getting used to and sometimes can be overwhelming, much like going to the library and looking at all the books that could possibly have your answer in it. Which is why just as when you're doing your family history research, you always want to keep a very clear goal in mind. I know when I was doing my studies, it was very easy to get distracted, and sometimes I would just take a Post-it note and I would write Edward Rohr, death, and the year that he died, and just stick it at the top of my computer. So if I was tempted to go start looking for something else, I was like, nope, I'm looking for Edward's death. That's my goal for right now. I can do that other thing later, but I've worked it out and decided that's what's gonna help me, that's my next step in finding my hometown. So we'll just skip through that. So I would like to say thank you for attending part 1 of German Research for the Everyday American, and show you this schedule again. And Dee will be sending out the announcement email for the next one. Not Quite Hieroglyphs, reading the old German handwriting, and that will be April 21st. Same time, same place, Zoom, where everything is. And then if you have, if you want to contact me if you have any questions about your family, we'll do a little Q&A just in a few seconds here. I also wanted to say, if you have any friends who might be interested in this little lecture series, but they couldn't make it or didn't know about it, I have recorded this session and I will be making it available on my YouTube account. It's currently the only thing on my YouTube account, but it will get better in the coming weeks. So I'll make it available there until the next one, until April 21st. So if anyone wants to catch up a little bit and work on this first part, I recommend, even if you did watch it and you want to go back and check out some tips, or just like kind of, have it up and pause it, go try out the skill, and then come back, you can do that. So definitely invite your friends, and I hope to see you next week. And if you have any questions, I'll open that up. I also want to say I'm not available to do it this